Hey, I'm Felissa Rose, and you're watching Keto and Crime.
Or later than usual, so that we may bring you the following NBC News special report.
James Warren Jones, better known as the Reverend Jim Jones. To some, he was a powerful spiritual leader, a good man. At various times, he said he was the reincarnation of Christ and Lenin. His 19-year-old son, Stephen, now sees him this way.
I hate this man for doing what he's done because he has destroyed everything I've lived for.
NBC News reports Jonestown, November 1978. How could it happen? In New York, here is NBC News correspondent Edwin Newman.
Good evening. It's now 4 days since 5 Americans were shot down by other Americans on the airstrip at Port 𝐒𝐞𝐬, Guyana. One of the dead was Representative Leo Ryan of California. 2 were NBC newsmen, correspondent Don Harris and cameraman Bob Brown. They had gone to investigate a cult called the People's Temple, headed by a man known as the Reverend Jim Jones, and they were killed by members of that cult. Appalling as that was, it did not prepare us for what was to follow. 400 suicides and killings, one of the most astonishing stories of our time, perhaps of any time.
Welcome back to Keto and Crime and Thought Crime. Today we're going into part 4 of the People's Temple and Jim Jones, the Guyana years, and the massacre itself. When we last left Jim Jones, he had just fled San Francisco, California, giving up a lot of political power because of a very poignant article to be appearing in New West magazine that basically blew the lid off the temple because of all the defectors that were coming out and telling about the abuses and the abuses of power that went on in the temple. So before that was actually published, he pulled up roots with about 1,000 of his loyalists and diverged on Jonestown. Now, there were actually 2 locations of the People's Temple in Guyana. There was Jonestown, the settlement that we all know about, that was about 2 hours from Georgetown, the capital, through the jungle. But at Georgetown, you also had a People's Temple house that was purchased and actually occupied by Sharon Ames and her 3 children, as well as other members of his inner sanctum on a rotating basis that actually took radio broadcasts from the States and checked up on the news and what was going on in California. So if you were in that People's Temple house, you were a loyalist to Jones. So he had you had People's Temple in Georgetown and the People's Temple in actual Jonestown. When Jim Jones arrived, the attitude around the People's Temple and the way of life changed. First of all, you had way more people than Jonestown could accommodate, and you had lots of people having to turn around and very quickly build shelters. Now, the People's Temple kind of descended into chaos because Archie Imes, who had done such a wonderful job setting up their agriculture and their buildings, had absconded with his wife and $45,000 of the People's Temple money and had left once he heard Jones was on his way. So Jones became very, very paranoid, very, very mistrusting of everybody because now he's seeing so many people in his inner circle leaving. Archie, you had Joyce Shaw, Bobby Houston, so many people that, Grace Stone, so many people that had been in his very inner workings that were now turning on him. Among them, his own daughter, Suzanne Jones, the younger of the 2 Korean children that they had adopted early on, had married another temple member by the name of Mike Cartmel. She and her husband left Jonestown not long after Jim Jones arrived, his own daughter. So from the time that she left to the time they both died, both Jim and Marceline referred to her as evil and the child they wish they had never had. So much for family loyalty, I suppose. So Jonestown went from a very nice place to be that did the things that it was intended to do, that is, give people a place where they could work together and live together and have fun together and, just live a good life, to a slave camp, because they had to quickly build shelters. So you had people sleeping in very overcrowded cabins. They basically dissolved all marriages because it was way too much logistical prowess was needed to put families together. So they just decided, okay, we're just going to dissolve all marriages because we really can't house all the families together. We don't have enough houses. So they basically split up families, put husbands and wives and brothers and sisters in separate cabins. They took all of the children from their parents, and the children were raised in one communal daycare center. They were able to spend a few hours each night with their biological parents. You had about 30 children born into that. Once they were born, their mothers had them for a little while to nurse them, and then they were taken and raised by women in this communal center. This was overseen by Marceline and by Annie Moore. So you had families split up. Also, before Jim Jones' arrival, they were eating fairly well. They had a balanced diet. But because of the strain on Jonestown resources, there just wasn't enough money coming in. That often happens with socialism and communism. You had people now being sustained on a cup of rice 3 times a day. So you went from having a rather balanced diet to living on rice 3 times a day, plus very back-breaking 12-hour days. When Archie was in charge, you had people working 7 or 8 hours a day, actually enjoying their jobs. When Jones arrived, he pretty much busied everybody to get the camp up to what he wanted very quickly. So you had people working 12, 14 hours a day, doing very back-breaking types of work, being fed a cup of rice 3 times a day, and pretty much held prisoner at night. At night, they were brought to the centralized pavilion that he had constructed in the middle of the camp, and they were subjugated to his rantings over and over on a nightly basis. That he continued to have the white nights, the practice mass suicides. This became a weekly event where people would just say, hey, when's our next practice suicide going to be? Can you imagine actually living like that? You also had people that were so slavishly loyal to him that he actually turned people against each other. Like, they listened to him hours upon hours a day. When they were working, there was a loudspeaker that was broadcasting his voice. All news that came in from the mainland came through him. It was given to him, and then he translated it out to his followers, so they never know the truth. They were not allowed to listen to radios, to have any news, to have any letters from their family. So they didn't know what was going on in the real world. And they only knew what Jones told them, which was that all first world countries were expelling people of color, putting them into concentration camps, making them think that the outside world had become a living hell. And that's what he was telling them. He was also telling them that he was sending people to them that were going to pretend to want to leave. And if they wanted to remain loyal to him and have the kind of paradise they wanted, they should turn them in. So people started ratting on each other pretty much. Nobody trusted anything. You had brothers telling on sisters, husbands telling on wives, and vice versa, children telling on parents. He fostered such an attitude of paranoia that people couldn't exist. You didn't know who to trust. To compound this, Jones had delved further into mental illness. He was also severely addicted to Quaaludes, so he wasn't always there, and a lot of his rantings became a slurred nightmare. And he would tell people that the doctor was giving him the wrong medicine, that he couldn't trust anybody, especially former lawyer Tim Stone, who by this time had seen what was going down and left Jonestown. He attempted to take John V. Stone, remember the child that he said was Jim Jones, but Jim Jones refused to let him take him. So now you had Tim Stone and Grace initiating a custody suit in the United States, trying to get their son back. So he delved even more into paranoia. He lived in the largest house in Jonestown, of course, that had a refrigerator, that had soft drinks, that had meat, that had salads, that vegetables, fruits. You know, he ate a balanced diet, as did his inner sanctum, because within the inner sanctum, with him in that same house, lived Marceline, lived Annie Moore, lived Carolyn Layton, and lived Maria Kataris. And there were Carolyn Layton's son, 𝐒𝐸, and John V. Stone. So, and Maria actually became John V. Stone's surrogate mother. She loved him. She raised him. And so you had him living openly with all of his lovers. Annie's main charge, outside of working some at the daycare center and working at the Temple Medical Clinic, was to be Jim Jones' personal nurse, and she's the one that kept him drugged up. You had Carolyn, who basically was the de facto leader. She had horned out Marceline a long time ago. She would travel between Georgetown and Jonestown quite a bit. She spent a lot of time with Sharon Ames at the Georgetown house, getting the news, listening to taking care of their affairs in the Guyana capital. A lot of Jonestown was now pretty much wrecked. They had, even though Archie Ames had done his best to grow crops and become self-sustainable, they had actually wrecked the topsoil at Jonestown, and so crops began to be harder to plant and would not grow, so they were finding themselves having to go deeper into the jungle and clear out more jungle land to try to plant crops. Also, Jones was so paranoid, even though the temple by late 1978 had about $28 million in liquid money at their disposal that he could have used to make conditions better for his followers at Jonestown, he did not. He was so fearful that the CIA and Tim Stone and every other crooked politician out there was after him that he refused to use any of it for the benefit of his people. And as a result, they became malnourished, they became overworked, they slipped into a dementia. You know, if you're overworked and starved, you're not quite right in the head. So you started to see a lot of cognitive dissonance among the people at Jonestown, and you had physical disease. Dysentery was a frequent plague that tormented the people of Jonestown. So you had just a lot of misery. Schoolhouse, which taught all levels, grade levels, and the women that were in his inner sanctum, Maria, Carolyn, Marceline, were the ones that taught at this school. They taught what Jim Jones thought the children of Jonestown should learn, and that was communist and socialist propaganda. They studied Lenin, Stalin. He was in frequent communication with the Soviet Union because it was his ultimate desire to defect to the Soviet Union and take his flock with him. But the Soviet Union, because we were approaching, the height of the Cold War, was a little apprehensive about taking him on. And as a result, you did have the CIA and the FBI looking into Jim Jones because of his communication with the Soviet Union. You also still had people in San Francisco that were slavishly loyal to him, that put out still that same newspaper that went out. You also had a lot of politicians like George Moscone and Jerry Brown and Willie Brown and Harvey Milk that spoke well of him. They kind of ignored the reports of what was going on in Jonestown. They considered it just pointless propaganda. So Jim Jones still, in America, didn't really have the reputation of being a madman. He was just a preacher that took his flock to Ghana. There really wasn't a whole lot of Jim Jones is crazy until after it all went down. Because of his paranoia, he decided he needed more protection, and he basically started his own Secret Service / Gestapo / private guard unit called the Red Brigade, led by Larry Layton. And these people were armed members of the temple that defended Jones and guarded the camp. They basically took up a perimeter around the camp and guarded it with automatic weapons. Punishment in the temple, there was no capital punishment officially, but there were boxes that were small that resembled, road prison solitary confinement boxes that were basically the size of coffins that anybody caught trying to leave, talking against Father Jones, as most of the people in the commune called him, would be put into these coffin-like boxes for days without food or water as punishment. They also were very liberal with giving them Valium, Thorazine, other barbiturates that would basically keep them in a stupor. So that's pretty much how they kept people under control was drugging them. 68% of the people at Jonestown were African American, and about 25% of the People's Temple were elderly, and their Social Security checks brought in about $65,000 a month. So now we're approaching fall of 1978. You have defectors back in California talking all kinds of smack against the People's Temple. You now have people, highly placed people like 𝐒𝐸 and Jackie Shaw, Jim Jones, one of Jim Jones' own children, defecting and coming back to California and telling heinous stories of the abuses that were going on down there. And you had a custody battle against, initiated by the Stones to get their son John V. Stone back. So you did finally have a new level of politician elected in California, and you had some that really wanted to investigate the People's Temple because so many of their constituents were members, and among them was Leo Ryan. Leo Ryan was born May 5th, 1925 in Nebraska. He was a Democrat representing the 11th Congressional District in California, which held the vast majority of Jonestown members. And as a result, he had a lot of communication with defectors and families of those people in Jonestown that were speaking out, saying what kind of abuses were going on in Jonestown. And so he began an investigation. And that only heightened, of course, Jim Jones' feelings of paranoia, but he was actually negotiating a visit to the People's Temple in late November of 1978 just to see what was going on. He had no preconceived notions. He just wanted to see what was going on. And after a lot of bureaucratic red tape between both Guyana and the People's Temple, they finally agreed that he could come down and visit between November 16th and November 18th of 1978. So now we're going to take up just a few days before the massacre occurred. Back home in the United States, some family members of people in the Jonestown commune were preparing to go with Leo Ryan and his assistant, Jackie Spire, down to Ghana, as well as reporters from NBC, including reporter Tim Reederman, who wrote the distinctive book on Jim Jones called Raven. This is where I got the majority of my information. Very well written book. I highly recommend it. I will put the link to it on Audible down below. Highly recommend checking that out. And you had photographers and other members of the family, including Sharon Ames' ex-husband, the first ex-husband, who was going down to visit his daughter, Leanne, who was living with her mother in Georgetown at the house, the People's Temple house in Ghana's capital. So you had them leave to go down around the 15th, 16th of November. They took off and landed in Georgetown and to make final preparations for their visit to Jonestown. Now, prior to them arriving, the Jonestown basketball team, which included all of Jim Jones' sons, except for Lou, you had Stephen, Jim Jones Jr., and Tim, all part of the Jonestown basketball team that was scheduled to play a game against the Guyanese national team in Jonestown from November 14th through 18th of 1978. And Jim Jones was wanting to cancel the visit because he wanted all of his family there. He wanted as many people under his thumb as he could get. But this was a huge point of contention between him and Marceline. Marceline really was pushing for her sons to be able to go and play that game. I think she knew that something bad was going to happen and she wanted to get them out of there. So there was a huge point of contention between the two, but it was agreed that they should go. So all of Jim Jones' sons, except for Lou, were actually in Georgetown when all this went down. They were staying at the Temple house to play their basketball games. Leo Ryan, upon arriving in Georgetown, went to the Temple house and kind of barged in to announce his arrival. He did shake hands with Stephen Jones and spoke to Sharon Ames to get final approval to go on to Jonestown. Sharon was pretty hostile with him, but she did radio ahead and finally get clearance for the reporters, for the family members, and for Congressman Ryan and his staff to go on into Jonestown. You had the visitors arriving at 𝐒𝐸𝐞𝐬, which was kind of the halfway point between Georgetown and Jonestown, on November 17th. They were met by a group of Jim Jones' Red Brigade, led by Larry Layton, and were taken back via a tractor pulling a cart to the People's Temple in Jonestown. Upon arrival, they were shown around the temple by Marcelin, shown the medical clinic, the school, the children's quarters. They were shown around, and then they were allowed to go talk to their relatives, for the ones that had come, and allowed to kind of commune. Later that night, they were treated to a sort of a banquet in the pavilion, where they saw things like fried chicken, salad, mashed potatoes, normal American food. Only come to find out that was specially planned for that night. I mean, they weren't just going to serve them a cup of rice, were they? And so they listened to the People's Temple Children's Choir sing. They were able to talk with relatives, and kind of honestly, Leo Ryan had a very good opinion of the People's Temple by this point. I mean, it seemed to him that people there were there because of their own volition, and he really wasn't thinking too much of it. But just before the banquet ended, you did have a couple of people that wanted to get out, that did pass notes to some of the reporters. One of them was actually seen by a young boy who actually called out, hey, he passed a note. And so you had a little bit of commotion. Jim Jones insisted that Leo and his staff stay overnight, so they slept in one of the cabins. None of them slept real well, they said, because they just felt they were being watched and really weren't wanted. Finally, the morning of November 18th, 1978, first thing Jim Jones does when he wakes up is radio Georgetown and order Sharon to tell his son and the basketball team to come back. Stephen Jones actually said, no, I'm not going to. We promised we were going to play the Guyanese team, and we were going to finish out our games. It wouldn't look good. And a huge argument between Stephen Jones, one of many that they'd had, over their time being on this earth, erupted. But in the end, the basketball team stayed, and they went on to play their game. So Leo Ryan and his staff are up, they're dressed, and they're heading out. He makes an announcement that anyone that wants to go with them is welcome to, not to worry about passports or anything like that. They'll take care of that in Jonestown because they're under the protection of the United States government. And about 15 people step out to go. You did have a confrontation between some parents and Marcelin Jones over them taking some of the minor children from the communal school. Their parents were going to leave, and they were going to take their children with them. You did have Congressman Ryan attacked by Red Brigade member Don Sly, who attacked and cut him with a knife. And of course, they were more than in a hurry to get out of there after that. So they did finally get the child. They boarded the dump truck and headed back to 𝐒𝐸𝐞𝐬, to the airstrip. While all this was going on, you had a small band of People's Temple members that wanted to get out without anyone knowing they had led by Leslie Wagner. She was the Leslie Wagner Wilson. She was a longtime People's Temple member that had been brought in by her mother, that were longtime members. And she wasn't digging the whole Jonestown experience. So she was among a group of people that escaped into the jungle about 9:30 that morning that found their way to Georgetown. She was actually married to Joe Wilson, a member of the Red Brigade. She carried their son, Jakari, who was 3. She tied him on her stomach flattened out with sheets, and carried him all the way through the jungle. About 30 miles they hiked to get out. All this is going on while the commotion with Leo Ryan is going on in the middle of Jonestown. Among the defectors that left for Port Kaituma was Larry Layton, a longtime member of the Red Brigade. Many of the other members that had left were very skeptical, and they begged Congressman Ryan not to allow him to go or to check him for weapons once they reached the airstrip. Congressman Ryan promised that they would indeed check him before he was allowed to board either of the planes. Remember, they came down on one small airplane, one small Cessna. Now they had to have two because there were way more people going back that had gone down, and they had radioed ahead for two planes. So they arrived at Port Kaituma. Once there, they disembarked, and according to the reporters like Tim Reederman that survived, Congressman Ryan did start checking people for weapons, the defectors. He did check them for weapons, and he started dividing them among the airplanes. They were both waiting to board their planes. Some people started to board a smaller plane, others the larger plane. Larry Layton was there. He was checked. No weapons were found on him. But before they could all board the planes, a contingent of Jones' Red Brigade pulled up behind them in a dump truck. They kind of surveyed as if they were looking for somebody. Obviously, they were looking for the congressman, and they began firing with automatic weapons. They killed Congressman Ryan. They killed several of the defectors. They killed some of the family members. They wounded Jackie Spear, Congressman Ryan's assistant, who's now a politician in California herself. She actually played dead. They killed the photographer from NBC, Tim Reederman. He was able to escape by running into the jungle. Once he was in the jungle, he said he heard silence, and then he heard more shots. Among those shooting was, of course, Larry Layton, because that had been his plan all along. He did have a handgun. It was his job, he said, to get into one of the planes and shoot the pilot in the head once they were airborne to kill everybody on the plane. And he did assist the Jonestown guards in shooting those that they had shot from a distance. They came back and shot them at point blank, and that's what Tim Reederman said. He heard silence, and many of the other survivors, some of the survivors did run into the jungle, and he said they heard silence, then they heard what sounded like very deliberate shots as the survivors were finished off. While that was going on, you had all hell breaking loose back at Jonestown. You had Jim Jones basically ordering a white night that his inner contingent, Marceline, Maria, Annie, all of them had a part in. They actually brought out a fruit-flavored drink. I've heard some people say it was Kool-Aid. Some people say it was Flavor-Aid. He did have Kool-Aid there. It was actually shown in reports. But he also had Flavor-Aid. So no one's really sure which he used. There's always a joke that he couldn't even spot, for the extra penny when they were going to kill themselves. But anyway, he started ordering people, his inner contingent, to bring out the fruit-flavored drink and mix it with cyanide, barbiturates, quaaludes. They basically put a whole ton of stuff that would stop your heart, bring you down, that kind of thing into this, and prepared for an actual mass suicide. All the time, Jim Jones ranting about how it's over, how there were people in the jungle that were going to kill the congressman, and he couldn't stop them, even though pretty plain that he had ordered it, and he could stop it at any time. And so he was speaking to his flock, telling them to prepare to step over. This was the best thing they could do.
Violence will take it by force. If we can't live in peace, then let's die in peace. We've been so betrayed. We have been so terribly betrayed. But we tried, and as Jack Beam often said, I don't know where he's at right this moment. Where's Jack? He said, if this only worked one day, it was worthwhile. Medicare. Because what's going to happen here in a matter of a few minutes is that one of those people on that plane is going to shoot the pilot. I know that. I didn't plan it, but I know it's going to happen. They're going to shoot that pilot, and down comes that plane into the jungle. And we had better not have any of our children left when it's over, because they'll parachute in here on us. I'm telling you just as plain as I know how to tell you. I've never lied to you. I never have lied to you. I know that's what's going to happen. That's what he intends to do. And he will do it. He'll do it. Fortunately, being so bewildered with many...
Christine Miller, who was a longtime member that had joined in the inner city of Los Angeles, she actually stood up and gave a very rousing reason as to why they shouldn't do this, and I'll play that for you here.
San Francisco will not be idle over this. And not take our death in vain, you know. Yes, Christine?
Is it too late for Russia?
Here's why it's too late for Russia. They killed. They started to kill. That's why it makes it too late for Russia. Otherwise, I'd said, Russia, you bet your life. But it's too late. I can't control these people. They're out there. They've gone with their guns, and it's too late. And once we kill anybody, at least that's the way I've always put my lot with you. If one of my people do something, it's me. Now they say I don't have to take the blame for this, but I don't live that way. They said deliver up Ujara, who tried to get the man back here. Ujara, whose mother has been lying on him and trying to break up this family, and they've all agreed to kill us by any means necessary. You think I'm going to deliver them, Ujara? Not on your life. No. No, you're not going. You're not going. You're not going. I can't live that way. I cannot live that way. I've lived for all, and I'll die for all. I've been living on hope for a long time, Christine, and I appreciate you've always been a very good agitator. I like agitation because you got to see two sides of one issue, two sides of a question. But what those people are going to get done, what they get through, will make our life worse than hell. Will make the Russians not accept us when they get through lying. They told so many lies between there and that truck that we are done in as far as any other alternative.
Well, I said let's make an airlift to Russia. That's what I say. I don't think nothing is impossible.
Well, how are we going to
believe it?
How are you going to airlift to Russia?
Well, I thought they said if we got in an emergency, they gave you a code to let them know.
No, they did. They gave us the code that they'd let us know of an issue, not us create an issue for them. They said if they saw the country coming down, they'd give us the code. They'd give us a code. You can check on there and see if it's on the code. You can check with Russia to see if they'll take us in immediately. Otherwise, we die. I don't know what else you say to these people. But to me, death is not a fearful thing. It's living that's treacherous. I have never seen anything like this before in my life. I've never seen people
give them their lives for those people that left.
You know how many left?
20 odd. That's a small
20 odd.
Compared to what's here.
20 odd. But what's going to happen when they don't leave? I hope that they could leave, but what's going to happen when they don't leave?
You mean the people here?
Yeah, what's going to happen to us when they don't leave, when they get on the plane and the plane goes down?
I don't think it'll go down.
You don't think it'll go down? I wish I could tell you were right, but I'm right. There's one man there who blames, and rightfully so, Debbie Blakey for the murder of his mother, and he'll stop that pilot by any means necessary. He'll do it. That plane will come out of the air. There's no way you fly a plane without a pilot.
I wasn't speaking about that plane. I was speaking about the plane for us to go to Russia. To Russia.
You think Russia's going to want? No, not going to. We're not. You think Russia's going to want us with all this stigma? We had some value, but now we don't have any value.
Well, I don't see it like that. I mean, I feel like that as long as there's life, there's hope. That's my faith.
Well, everybody dies. Someplace that hope runs out because everybody dies. I haven't seen anybody yet didn't die. And I like to choose my own kind of death for a change. I'm tired of being tormented to hell. That's what I'm tired of. Tired of it. 1,200 people's lives in my hand.
But I look at our babies and I think they deserve to live.
I agree.
You know?
But also they deserve, what's more, they deserve peace.
We all came here for peace.
And have we had it?
No.
I've tried to give it to you. I've laid down my life practically. I've practically died every day to give you peace, and you've still not had any peace. You look better than I've seen you in a long while, but it's still not the kind of peace that I wanted to give you. So, a person's a fool that continues to say that you're winning when you lose it.
Stopped to rest.
It's over, sister. It's over. We've made that day. We made a beautiful day. And let's make it a beautiful day. That's what
We win when we go down. Tim Stone has nobody else to hate. He has nobody else to hate. Then he'll destroy himself. I'm speaking here not as the administrator. I'm speaking as a prophet today.
But unfortunately, another member of the temple did kind of shut her up by saying that her life had been extended to this day because of Father Jones, and she should just take her poison, pretty much. It was also about the time that Christine Miller stopped speaking that the murder squad from Port Kaituma arrived back in Jonestown and told Jim Jones that the deed was done, and he announced to his flock that the congressman has been shot, the congressman has been murdered. So there's no going back now. They'll torture us. They'll torture our seniors. They'll torture our children. We've got to step over. We've got to take the poison like they did in ancient Greece. This man was crazy. And so they started with the children. They actually took the children that were, in a communal living arrangement and started herding them up, and they started taking syringes without needles and shooting the liquid into their mouth. You had parents that were grabbing their children, trying to run with them. Those parents were taken by the Red Brigade. Their children were given the poison, and the parents were injected with actual syringe needles in the arms. No one was getting away. And once all of the children were gone, the adults started drinking the poison willingly, too. They would actually go up, take a cup, drink it, and go out to lay with their family and die. I don't know, a nice way to say that. I don't know if you've ever seen or read about cyanide poisoning, but it's not pleasant. That's even one thing that another promise that Jim Jones broke, that it wasn't painful. Death by cyanide's not pleasant. It closes your airways. It causes you to convulse. It causes you to froth at the mouth. None of these were peaceful deaths. They were very painful deaths on top of everything else. And so you had these people, whether or not they really wanted to, I think they felt there was no other way out. And so they started taking it. Those that didn't want to were held at gunpoint and injected with it, including Christine Miller. And eventually they were all dead. They had all expired. Jim Jones forever continued to talk until every last person was dead. And being that he couldn't bear to take the poison like a normal person, like a normal member of his flock, he was actually found dead of a gunshot wound to the back of the head, which leads people to believe that he ordered one of his Red Brigade members to shoot him. Among the dead were members of Jones' families. Lou Jones and his wife and baby were dead. Agnes Jones, his adopted daughter, her husband and 4 children died. In the Jones house, Annie Moore was found dead, as was Maria Cantaris, as well as John Victor Stone and Chemo, the son he had with Carolyn Layton, as well as Carolyn Layton, were all found dead in Jim Jones' in the house that he shared with them. Now, Marcelin Jones was found lying among the children. It is very highly rumored that she waited until all the children were dead and then took the poison herself willingly. And all the time knowing that her sons were safe, that she had saved as many of her sons as she could. And I have mixed feelings about Marcelin Jones and the entire inner sanctum. They were pretty much in control. Jim Jones was so whacked out on drugs that they could have easily stopped this, but there were letters and communications found between these women that were in his inner sanctum that showed they were just as evil and demented as he is. They were talking about the logistics of doing a mass suicide. How would we kill everybody? So do I hold Jim Jones 100% responsible? No. I think his inner sanctum, these women that he knew so well that were just as deeply involved as he was. Now, Jonestown and Port Kaituma were not the only places where people died. Also in Georgetown, you had Sharon Ames, who had allowed her oldest daughter Leanne to meet her father briefly as he came over, and then her father was actually not at Port Kaituma. He had actually made plans with Leanne to take her fishing the next day, so he had come to the Georgetown house to see his daughter, had dinner with her, had a very pleasant conversation, and then promised to pick her up about 7 in the morning, and had gone back to his hotel. So he wasn't at Port Kaituma when all this went down. So Leanne was able to reconnect with her father before she died. But Sharon, following Jim Jones' orders, actually killed her 2 youngest children, Krista and Martin, age 11 and 10, with knives. Then asked her older daughter, Leanna, to slit her throat, which Leanna did. Once Sharon was dead, Leanna slit her own throat and died. And this was what Stephen Jones and the basketball team walked back into when they returned from their game. And no, none of them took their own lives. Stephen Jones said he realized at that moment that his mother had saved him and his 2 brothers. Later that day, reports started to come into Georgetown and the United States. The airstrip was searched for survivors, and his survivors were taken to various military hospitals in South America before being transferred back to the United States. A contingent of Guyanese and American military actually went into Jonestown to do the cleanup. They said that they actually thought they were going in to arrest Jones for the murders at the airstrip. And once they flew over, they said what looked like confetti on the ground at Jonestown turned out to be bodies. Once they landed, they discovered that most of the People's Temple, over 918 people, were dead. The only survivors were the ones that had defected into the jungle, and one 76-year-old woman that hid under her bed when Jones called the White Knight that day. And she was found hiding in her cabin. Among the papers were found the communications between the Inner Sanctum, where they were talking about the logistics of how to do this, as well as what could only be construed as the People's Temple, Jim Jones' last will and testament, written by Marcelin, that basically willed everything to the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. There's a lot of conspiracy theories related to the Jonestown Massacre. Reach among them was CIA involvement in the wiping out of Jonestown. There's rumors that the CIA actually installed Jim Jones down there as a way to overthrow the Guyanese government, and he turned against them. An agent named Richard Dwyer actually set up the assassination attempt of Congressman Ryan to essentially frame the People's Temple and basically get them wiped out, and that this CIA agent by the name of Dwyer was actually at Port Kaituma and was shot during the massacre himself because he was part of setting it up. Now, none of that's ever been substantiated, but there's lots of rumors like that. In the end, what do I think? I think Jim Jones was a product of his environment. I think this man was doomed from the womb. He was a severely mentally ill boy that was neglected and raised by 2 very mentally ill people who basically neglected him. He was then raised by a religious zealot, And his earliest memories was of religion. I think religion kind of went to his head, and then as did the readings of communism and socialism, and it all kind of got muddled in his head. And being severely mentally ill, later on having a drug problem, I think he just ascended into madness and took his people with him. Do I think he's evil? Yeah, I think he's pretty much evil. Anybody that can do the kinds of things that he did, mentally ill or not, has to have some sort of evil in him. I would lead to believe, I couldn't really find any notes on his autopsy, so I would lead him to believe that he was probably a psychopath and a sociopath both. I don't think he was capable of true empathy, so I think that was a lot. Now, do I think he's the only one responsible for this? No. The women that were his inner sanctum were just as guilty. They could have stopped this at any time, especially considering that Jones was highly debilitated because of drug use. I think they could have stopped this at any time and didn't. So they are easily guilty and pretty evil themselves. So I don't put this all on Jim Jones, but this would never have happened if it hadn't have been for him. I think his foray into socialism, wanting to do good, was just a cover for his actual intentions of wanting to be a dictator, much like Stalin and Lenin and Hitler that he had read about as a child, coupled with being exposed to religion and seeing how religion can be used as a tool to control minds. I think it was just the perfect storm. I think, like Hitler, he was the perfect personification of evil for his time. Now, as I said, a lot of conspiracy theories. The Dwyer one, there was also rumors that the Layton family were highly involved in the CIA, and actually Larry Layton's sister Debbie was one of the treasurers, and she did defect. She left Jonestown before November 18th, 1978, so that's probably, to me, the conspiracy theory that holds the most water, is that maybe the CIA had something to do with it, though I can't really find anything substantiating it, just a couple of news articles from tabloids of the day that talk about it. So, in the end, I think we have to come to the consensus that he was just an evil man that started a cult, descended into delusion, took his followers with him, and the result were both suicides and murder. Some of these people did commit suicide, but some of them were out and out murdered. And so that's the way I look at it. To date, it is still the largest mass suicide on record here in the United States, and I hope nothing ever outdoes it. I hope we don't have another one of this caliber ever. But I have truly, truly enjoyed doing this. I hope you have too. I will be back very soon with a white-collar crime video. I will also be back next weekend with our next round of deep dives. I will be taking on the Chris and Shanann Watts case, so that'll probably be a multi-parter. I hope you'll tune in for that. Always support the channel. Links are below. Always appreciated, never required. Thanks so much, everyone. 𝐒𝐨𝐿 out.